The delivery van rolled up to the grand estate, its tires crunching on the pristine gravel driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, an architectural marvel with towering white pillars and expansive windows that seemed to gleam with a smug opulence. Inside the van sat a man who had seen plenty of such homes, but rarely felt welcomed in them. His uniform, though neatly pressed, bore the weight of countless hours of hard work. As he stepped out, balancing a large package in his hands, he glanced at the massive iron gates now closing behind him, sealing him off from the world outside. His eyes flicked upward to the towering façade of the house. Even from the driveway, he could feel the weight of its grandeur pressing down. It wasn't just the size of the mansion or the finely manicured gardens, it was the air of superiority that seemed to cling to places like this. Taking a steadying breath, he adjusted his cap and headed toward the front door, feeling the package shift slightly in his grasp. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing a sharply dressed man and woman. The woman's diamond necklace sparkled under the porch lights, while the man's tailored suit looked like it cost more than most people's annual salary. Their eyes landed on the delivery man, and a moment of silence stretched uncomfortably long. The man's lips curled slightly in an expression that was anything but friendly. "Leave it there," the woman said curtly, gesturing vaguely toward the steps. Her tone carried a sharpness that suggested she was used to being obeyed without question. The delivery man hesitated. "Ma'am, this requires a signature," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man in the suit stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Do you not understand simple instructions?" "Leave it and go," he barked, as though speaking to a child. The delivery man stood his ground, his gaze steady. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a high-value delivery. Company policy requires a signature before I can leave it." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically, turning to her husband with an exaggerated sigh. "Is this really necessary? Do we have to deal with this?" Her words dripped with disdain, the emphasis on this landing like a slap in the air. The man muttered something under his breath and snatched the package from the delivery man's hands. "Fine, just give me the stupid thing to sign," he snapped, scribbling his name carelessly on the device before thrusting it back. The delivery man offered a polite nod. "Thank you, sir. Have a good day." He turned to leave, his steps measured, but the woman's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Wait a minute," she said sharply. "Did you touch the door handle?" Her eyes were wide with indignation, as though he'd committed a grave offense. The man turned back, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, ma'am, I did," he replied cautiously. She let out a huff, reaching for a sanitizing wipe from a nearby table. "Unbelievable," she muttered, scrubbing the handle as though it had been contaminated. Her husband smirked, shaking his head. "You people just don't know boundaries, do you?" The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The delivery man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Years of dealing with similar treatment had taught him that arguing was rarely worth the effort. He simply nodded, turned back toward his van, and walked away, his back straight and his head held high. As he opened the van door, he heard the faint sound of laughter from the mansion. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't born of humor but of mockery. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way, and sadly, he knew it wouldn't be the last. But there was something different about this moment. Beneath his calm exterior, something stirred, a quiet resolve that refused to let the experience define him. The man didn't just deliver packages, he observed people. Every interaction, every comment, every glance, he took it all in, filing it away like pieces of a puzzle. The couple who had just dismissed him as beneath them would never have guessed who he truly was or what he had accomplished. They saw only his uniform, the color of his skin, and the role they assumed he played in the world. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the years he'd spent building something extraordinary, the sacrifices he'd made, or the legacy he was creating. They didn't know that the very package he just delivered was part of a deal he had brokered, one that would change not only his life but the lives of countless others. As he climbed back into his van, the laughter from the mansion still ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but smile, a small, knowing smile that held the weight of everything he hadn't said. One day, he thought, they'll understand. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, leaving the grand estate behind. The road stretched out ahead of him, lined with trees that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The van's radio crackled faintly, filling the silence with the soft hum of music. For a moment, he let the rhythm wash over him, steadying his thoughts. He knew better than to dwell on the insults. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. The day wasn't over yet, and there were still more deliveries to make. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had been more than just another routine stop. Something about it felt significant, as though it were the beginning of a story yet to unfold. Back at the mansion, the couple had already forgotten about the delivery man. They were too busy admiring their new acquisition, a rare piece of art they'd imported from overseas. "Can you believe the nerve of him?" the woman said, shaking her head. Her husband chuckled. "It's just the way people like him are," he replied dismissively. But their laughter would soon fade. Their assumptions, their arrogance, their sense of superiority, it was all built on a foundation of ignorance. They had no idea that the man they had ridiculed was someone far greater than they could imagine. And when the truth finally came to light, it would shatter their carefully constructed world. For now, the delivery man remained an enigma, his true identity hidden behind the simplicity of his uniform. But he carried with him a quiet power, a resilience that refused to be diminished by the prejudice of others. And as he drove away from the mansion, a subtle but undeniable shift began to take place, a shift that would set the stage for a moment they would never forget. The van rumbled down the road, the delivery man's grip steady on the wheel. His thoughts replayed the scene at the mansion like a record stuck on the same groove. It wasn't the first time he'd faced that kind of treatment, but something about it had settled in his chest, heavy and unmoving. He shook his head slightly, trying to push the encounter out of his mind. There were more deliveries to make, and the day wasn't going to wait for him to dwell on people like that couple. Still, he couldn't entirely let it go. The radio hummed faintly in the background, the static cutting in and out as he drove through patches of trees. He reached for the knob, turning the volume down to think. Outside the window, the scenery shifted from manicured suburbs to modest neighborhoods, the kind of places where families worked hard and lived simply. These streets felt familiar, comfortable even, though they were far from where he'd grown up. The man wasn't always a delivery driver. His current uniform and routine were the result of choices made years ago, choices he didn't regret, though they had led to a life far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Most people who opened their doors to him never saw past the logo on his shirt, or the packages in his hands. They didn't know about the man behind the uniform or the history he carried. And he preferred it that way, for the most part. Years ago, he had walked away from a life that would have made most people envious. The corporate world, with its suits and boardrooms, had promised him wealth and prestige, but it had come at a cost he wasn't willing to pay. He had watched as people around him lost themselves in the endless grind for more money, more status, more power. It wasn't for him. So he left it behind, choosing instead to build something meaningful on his terms. He had started small, just an idea and a notebook filled with sketches and notes. It had taken years of sacrifice, long nights, and sheer determination to turn that idea into reality. But he had done it. The company he'd built wasn't flashy or famous, and that was intentional. It wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about creating something that made a difference, even if only a few people ever knew his name. The delivery man's mind drifted to the package he just dropped off at the mansion. It wasn't just another shipment, it was part of a much bigger picture. The art piece the wealthy couple had so eagerly signed for was one of a kind, created by a craftsman he had personally commissioned. The delivery wasn't random, it was part of a larger network he had painstakingly built, connecting creators with buyers who valued authenticity and skill. But the couple didn't know that. They didn't know they were holding a piece of a system he had designed, a system that thrived because he had chosen to remain in the background. As the van rolled into the parking lot of a small CAF, the man checked the clock on the dashboard. He had a few minutes before his next delivery, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee was too tempting to ignore. He stepped inside, the warm scent of roasted beans greeting him like an old friend. The barista behind the counter offered a smile as she prepared his usual order without needing to ask. This CAF was one of the few places where he felt truly at ease. The staff treated everyone with kindness, no matter who they were or how they looked. It was a small sanctuary in a world that often seemed too quick to judge. He took his coffee to a corner table, savoring the first sip as he watched people come and go. Here, he wasn't a delivery man or a businessman or anything in between. He was just another face in the crowd. The peace didn't last long, though. His phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a name he hadn't seen in weeks. He hesitated before answering, his thumb hovering over the screen. When he finally picked up, the voice on the other end was both familiar and urgent. "They know," the voice said without preamble. "I don't know how, but they figured it out." He didn't need to ask who or what. His mind raced, piecing together the implications of those two words. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "Positive. I got the confirmation this morning. They've been digging into everything, your background, the company, even the deliveries. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots." The delivery man leaned back in his chair, his coffee forgotten. He had been careful, meticulous even, in keeping his identity separate from the company and its operations. But if someone was determined enough, cracks could appear. And if they did, the life he'd worked so hard to build could come crashing down. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Thanks for letting me know." He ended the call and stared at the phone for a moment, his mind racing. If the wrong people had discovered who he really was, it could jeopardize everything, not just for him, but for the people who depended on him. The network he had built wasn't just about art or commerce, it was a lifeline for creators who had been overlooked or undervalued. He couldn't let it fall apart. As he left the CAF and climbed back into the van, his thoughts returned to the couple at the mansion. He wondered if they would ever truly appreciate the piece they had purchased, or if it would simply become another status symbol, gathering dust in their home. He doubted they would ever know the hands that had crafted it, or the journey it had taken to reach them. The day wore on, and the delivery man made his rounds, dropping off packages and exchanging brief pleasantries with strangers. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating his next steps. The warning from the phone call loomed over him like a dark cloud, pushing him to act quickly. He couldn't afford to wait and see how things played out. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the streets in a golden glow, the man had made up his mind. He pulled the van into his driveway and stepped out, the weight of the day finally settling on his shoulders. The modest home he returned to each night was a far cry from the mansion he had visited that morning, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe and think clearly. Inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out papers and notes in front of him. He had always been a planner, someone who preferred to think 10 steps ahead. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. If someone was digging into his life, they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the truth. And when they did, the carefully constructed world he had built could unravel. He reached for a folder tucked at the bottom of the stack, its edges worn from years of use. Inside were documents he hadn't looked at in a long time, proof of who he really was and the life he had left behind. He flipped through the pages, his fingers lingering on a photograph tucked between them. It was a picture of him from years ago, dressed in a sharp suit and standing in front of a gleaming skyscraper. The man in the photo looked confident, almost cocky, but the delivery man staring at it now saw the exhaustion behind the smile. That version of himself had been chasing something he no longer valued, climbing a ladder that led nowhere. It was a reminder of why he had walked away and why he couldn't let the past catch up to him now. As the night deepened, the delivery man made a series of phone calls, his voice calm and measured despite the urgency of his words. He spoke to trusted allies, people who had stood by him through thick and thin, and laid out a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to protect what he had built. By the time he finally went to bed, his mind was still racing, but there was a sense of resolve beneath the chaos. He didn't know who was after him or why, but he wasn't going to let them win. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he would face them head on, just as he always had. But for now, in the quiet of his home, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the fight was far from over. The next morning came too quickly, the weight of the night's planning still heavy on the delivery man's shoulders. The world outside seemed untouched by the storm brewing in his life. The sun filtered through the blinds as if it were just another ordinary day. But for him, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every sound, every passing car, made him alert, his senses heightened as if the walls of his carefully built life were closing in. The van felt smaller than usual as he started his route, the hum of the engine a constant companion to his racing thoughts. Each stop along the way seemed to take longer, though the customers were none the wiser. Polite smiles and routine exchanges masked the unease simmering beneath his calm exterior. Every time he handed off a package, his mind jumped to the possibility that someone could be watching, waiting for him to slip up. The couple from the mansion lingered in his thoughts. Their dismissive words had been a sharp reminder of the world he had tried to leave behind, a world obsessed with appearances and hierarchies, where people were judged by their clothes, their cars, or the color of their skin. They wouldn't have guessed in a million years that the delivery man they had belittled held more power and influence than they could ever imagine. And yet that power came with a cost. As the day went on, his phone buzzed repeatedly, messages coming through from the network he had set up. Reports of unusual inquiries and probing questions confirmed his fears. Someone was actively searching for him, piecing together fragments of his past and present. He clenched the steering wheel tighter, the realization sinking in that time was running out. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they exposed him, and the consequences would ripple far beyond his own life. At one stop, a young artist greeted him at the door, her hands stained with paint and her face lighting up as she accepted a package. She was one of the many creators who had found a lifeline through his efforts, her talent finally recognized and valued. The delivery man couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. If everything fell apart, what would happen to her and others like her? They had placed their trust in a system he had built, unaware of the risks now threatening to tear it all down. Back in the van, he reached for his phone and made another call, this one to an old friend who had been with him since the beginning. Their conversation was brief but heavy, each word carrying the weight of the situation. There were steps they could take, contingencies they had planned for, but it wouldn't be easy. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. By the afternoon, the tension had reached a breaking point. He had one last delivery to make, and it wasn't just any package. It was a piece of immense value, the kind of work that could draw attention if it ended up in the wrong hands. He had planned this delivery carefully, ensuring it would go to someone who understood its worth. But now, with everything happening around him, he wasn't sure if even his most trusted contacts were safe. As he approached the address, his instincts told him something was off. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, and the air seemed charged with an unspoken tension. He parked the van a few houses down and took a moment to assess his surroundings. The package sat in the passenger seat, its presence almost mocking him with its significance. Stepping out of the van, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. He had been in situations like this before, where danger lurked just out of sight. But this time, the stakes were personal. He carried the package to the door, his steps deliberate, and knocked twice. The seconds stretched into an eternity before the door opened, revealing a man who seemed just as wary as he felt. The exchange was quick, both men aware of the invisible clock ticking down. As the delivery man turned to leave, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. A sleek black car was parked down the street, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants. He felt his pulse quicken, though his face remained impassive. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone was watching. Back in the van, he pulled away slowly, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. The black car stayed in place, but the unease it brought didn't fade. He took a winding route back toward the city, his mind working through possibilities. If they were watching him, they were waiting for something. But what? Did they want to confront him, expose him, or something worse? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, he made a decision. He couldn't keep running or hiding. Whoever was behind this needed to be confronted, but on his terms. He couldn't afford to let them dictate the next move. He drove to a place he hadn't visited in years, a nondescript building on the edge of town that housed an old contact who owed him a favor. The man inside was older now, his sharp eyes softened by age but still carrying a spark of intelligence. The delivery man laid out the situation, sparing no details. The older man listened intently, nodding occasionally, and then stood. Without a word, he disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a small device no larger than a deck of cards. "This will give you answers," the older man said, his voice steady. "But it'll also paint a target on your back. Use it wisely." The delivery man nodded, slipping the device into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he left the building, the black car was nowhere to be seen, but he knew better than to think he was in the clear. The shadows felt alive, every corner a potential threat. That night, back at home, he activated the device, watching as it illuminated with a soft blue glow. It was a tracker, designed to trace the origins of the inquiries and messages that had been flooding his network. The screen filled with data, lines of text and numbers scrolling faster than he could read. And then, it stopped. One name appeared on the screen, a name that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't a stranger or a rival. It was someone he had trusted, someone he had worked with closely in the early days of building his network. The betrayal cut deeper than he expected, and he felt the weight of it settle in his chest. The next move was clear, but it wouldn't be easy. He had to confront them, to find out why they had turned on him and what they hoped to gain. But more than that, he had to protect the people who depended on him. The network wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline, a symbol of hope for those who had been overlooked or dismissed. As the clock ticked past midnight, the delivery man sat in the dim light of his kitchen, his mind racing. The betrayal, the looming threat, and the stakes of the situation all collided in a storm of emotions. But beneath it all, there was a steely resolve. He had faced challenges before, and he would face this one, too. The fight wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just beginning. The next morning, the delivery man woke with a new sense of determination, but the heaviness of the betrayal still lingered. He hadn't slept much, and the early rays of sunlight filtering through his window did little to ease his mind. The name on the screen from the night before felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about loyalty and trust. Why would someone so close to him take such a dangerous path? And more importantly, what were they after? The streets were already alive with the buzz of the city as he loaded up his van, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. Day wasn't just another day of deliveries. He had set up a meeting with the one person he knew could shed light on the situation, the person whose name appeared on that screen. It wasn't going to be easy, confronting someone who had once been an ally. But he needed answers, and he needed them now. The meeting point was a quiet CAF tucked away in a less traveled part of town. It was neutral ground, chosen deliberately to avoid drawing too much attention. As he entered, the familiar scent of coffee mixed with the faint hum of conversation. The person he was meeting was already there, sitting at a corner table with their back to the wall. They looked up as he approached, their face betraying nothing but calm indifference. He sat down, his movements measured, and wasted no time getting to the point. "I know it's you," he said quietly, his voice firm but steady. The other person didn't flinch, their expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence between them felt louder than the clatter of cups and murmured conversations around them. "I don't know what you're talking about," they replied, their tone cool and detached. But there was a flicker of something in their eyes, guilt, perhaps, or fear. It was enough to confirm his suspicions. "You've been digging into the network," he said, leaning in slightly. "Asking questions, stirring up trouble. Why? What are you hoping to gain?" The other person hesitated, their composure cracking just enough to let a sliver of emotion through. "It's not what you think," they said finally, their voice barely above a whisper. "I had no choice." Before he could press further, the door to the CAF opened, and two men in dark suits stepped in, their eyes scanning the room. The delivery man recognized the type immediately: professionals, the kind of people who didn't show up without a purpose. His heart rate quickened, though his face remained calm. Whoever they were, they weren't here for coffee. The tension in the room shifted as the men approached their table. One of them spoke, his voice low and authoritative. "We need to talk. Now." The person sitting across from him stiffened, their face pale. Without a word, they stood, their movements slow and deliberate. The delivery man stayed seated, watching as the two men flanked them and guided them toward the exit. As they passed, one of the men turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Stay out of this," he said firmly before walking out the door. For a moment, the delivery man sat frozen, his mind racing. The scene had played out too smoothly, too deliberately, to be a coincidence. Whoever those men were, they were connected to the larger web of events unfolding around him. And now, his one lead was gone, whisked away before he could get the answers he needed. As he left the CAF, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message, but not from any number he recognized. The text was brief but chilling: "You're in over your head. Walk away while you still can." He clenched his jaw, the words only fueling his resolve. If someone was trying to scare him off, it meant he was closer to the truth than he realized. But the message also confirmed something he had suspected from the beginning: he wasn't just dealing with one person's betrayal. There was a much bigger game at play, and he had just become a target. Back in the van, he pulled up the tracker, hoping it could provide more information. The device had already traced several connections, forming a web of names and locations that painted a clearer picture of the network's infiltration. But one name stood out, one he hadn't expected to see: the wealthy client from the mansion. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. Could they have been involved all along? The pieces started to fall into place, their disdainful remarks and dismissive attitude taking on a new, more sinister meaning. If they were connected to the group trying to dismantle his network, then the situation was more dangerous than he had imagined. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. With the address of the mansion already burned into his memory, he headed straight there, his mind racing with possibilities. The road seemed longer than before, the weight of what he might find pressing heavily on his shoulders. By the time he reached the grand gates, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling estate. This time, he didn't bother with subtlety. Parking his van just outside the gates, he made his way to the intercom and pressed the button. A few moments later, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with the owner," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's urgent." There was a pause, followed by the sound of the gates unlocking. As he walked up the long driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But he had come too far to turn back now. The door opened before he could knock, and the wealthy client stood there, their expression unreadable. "You've got some nerve showing up here," they said, their voice cold. "I could say the same to you," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The opulent interior of the mansion felt almost suffocating, the weight of its grandeur only adding to the tension. "You've been meddling where you don't belong," the client said, their tone sharp. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," he shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to destroy something I've spent years building." The client laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "You think this is about you? You're just a pawn in a much larger game. And if you don't back off, you'll regret it." Their words only confirmed what he already knew: there was more at stake here than just his network. But before he could respond, a door at the far end of the room opened, and another figure stepped out. It was someone he recognized immediately, someone he never expected to see again. The second twist hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. The person standing before him wasn't just another player in this game, they were someone from his past, someone who knew his secrets better than anyone else. And judging by the look in their eyes, they weren't here to help. The room fell silent, the tension thick as the delivery man's gaze locked with the figure from his past. His breath hitched, the air heavy with the weight of old memories and unresolved betrayal. It was someone he had trusted once, someone who had walked beside him in his struggles. But now, standing in this grand mansion with the wealthy client, their presence felt like a knife twisting in his back. "Well, well," the person said, their tone light but with an edge of mockery. "Look who's been busy connecting the dots." "You," the delivery man said, his voice low but steady. "You're behind all of this." The person smirked, glancing at the client before taking a step closer. "Not everything, but enough. You always had a knack for sniffing out trouble. Too bad you don't know when to stop." The wealthy client leaned against the edge of a sleek, marble table, arms crossed. "He's a stubborn one," they said, almost amused. "But that's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't know how to let go." "Let go of what?" the delivery man demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "This isn't just about me. You're tearing apart lives, ruining something that was built to help people." The figure from his past raised a brow, their expression hardening. "Help people? Don't kid yourself. You built this for control, for power. And now you're paying the price." The delivery man's fists clenched, his emotions a storm brewing inside him. "You don't know what you're talking about. The network wasn't about control. It was about giving people a chance, a voice. Something you used to believe in too." The room went quiet again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes, a shadow of the person he had once known. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. "This isn't going to end the way you think," the figure said, their voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've uncovered too much, and now you're a liability." The delivery man tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act. But before he could move, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. A group of men appeared, their presence unmistakably threatening. They were clearly hired muscle, their expressions cold and unyielding. "You didn't think we'd let you leave, did you?" the client said with a smug smile. The delivery man scanned the room, his mind racing. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. But he wasn't out of options. Reaching into his pocket, he pressed a small button on his phone, a silent signal he had prepared for emergencies. It was a gamble, but it was all he had left. The hired men closed in, their movements deliberate and menacing. The delivery man held his ground, his eyes darting between them and the two people he once thought he understood. Just as the first man reached for him, the front door burst open, a sharp gust of wind carrying in the sound of chaos. "Stop right there!" a commanding voice rang out. Uniformed officers flooded the room, their presence an overwhelming force. The hired men froze, their confidence evaporating in the face of law enforcement. The wealthy client's smug expression melted into one of shock, and the figure from his past stepped back, their composure faltering. The delivery man felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he kept his face calm. The silent signal had worked, summoning help just in time. But the relief was short-lived as the figure from his past turned to him, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't understand," they said, their voice trembling. "This was bigger than us. Bigger than you." The delivery man didn't reply, his gaze steady and unyielding. The officers began cuffing the hired men and the client, their protests drowned out by the commotion. But as the figure from his past was led away, they turned back one last time, their expressions softening. "I didn't have a choice," they said quietly, their voice barely audible over the chaos. "But you did. And you made yours." The words hit him harder than he expected, leaving him standing there in the middle of the opulent room as the dust settled around him. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The network was safe for now, but the cost had been high. Trust had been broken, and the scars of betrayal would linger. As he walked out of the mansion, the cool evening air greeted him, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from an unknown number. This time, the text was brief but pointed. "You think it's over? It's not." He stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The wealthy client, the figure from his past, the shadowy forces pulling the strings, they were part of something much larger. And now, he was in the middle of it. The delivery man slipped his phone back into his pocket and walked toward his van, his steps steady and purposeful. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The drive back was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence as the delivery man replayed everything that had happened. The opulence of the mansion, the unexpected betrayal, the clash of power. It felt surreal, like something out of a story. But it wasn't a story, it was his life. The weight of it all pressed down on him, yet there was a strange sense of clarity in the aftermath. As he pulled into the driveway of his modest home, he noticed the light in the front window was on. It was comforting, a reminder of the life he had built far away from the glitz and greed that had just tried to pull him under. He stepped out of the van and stretched, his muscles still tense from the evening's events. The crisp night air felt like a balm against the storm of thoughts in his head. Inside, he was greeted by the familiar warmth of his home. The walls were lined with framed photographs of happier times, snapshots of people he had helped, milestones he had achieved, and moments that reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. He stood in the quiet living room, his eyes lingering on a particular photo of his late mentor, the man who had inspired him to build the network that had become such a target. He couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "We did it," he said softly, as if the man in the photo could hear him. "It's safe for now." The buzz of his phone broke the silence, and he hesitated before answering. It was a call from one of his trusted friends, someone who had been helping him piece together the bigger picture. Their voice on the other end was cautious but relieved. "I heard what happened," they said. "You okay?" "Yeah," he replied, sinking into a chair. "For the most part. But it's not over. They'll regroup, and next time, they'll come harder." There was a pause before his friend spoke again. "Then we'll be ready. You're not in this alone, you know." He nodded, though they couldn't see him. "Thanks. I'll need all the help I can get." After the call ended, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The weight of the network's safety was heavy, but knowing he wasn't alone made it more bearable. The events of the evening had exposed cracks in the foundation of trust, but they had also solidified his resolve to protect what he had built. He knew now that it wasn't just about him, it was about the countless lives that depended on the network, the opportunities it created, and the hope it inspired. Over the next few weeks, the delivery man worked tirelessly to strengthen the network's security, both digital and physical. He reached out to his community, rallying those who believed in the mission and wanted to see it thrive. Together, they implemented new protocols, ensuring that the network couldn't be easily infiltrated again. It was a team effort, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't carrying the burden alone. As the dust settled, news of the wealthy client's arrest began to circulate. It turned out their shady dealings extended far beyond what the delivery man had uncovered, and the authorities were unraveling a web of corruption that had spanned years. The revelation brought a sense of justice, though it was bittersweet. The figure from his past had vanished after the arrest, leaving behind more questions than answers. Despite their betrayal, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story, a story he might never fully understand. One evening, as he was closing up the small community center where he often met with his team, a young man approached him. He was hesitant, clutching a folder of papers to his chest. The delivery man recognized the look in his eyes, determination mixed with uncertainty. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone kind. The young man nodded. "I heard about what you're doing with the network. I want to be a part of it. I have some ideas, and I think they could make a difference." The delivery man studied him for a moment before smiling. "Come inside. Let's talk." As the two of them sat down to go over the young man's ideas, the delivery man felt a spark of hope. It was moments like this that reminded him why he fought so hard, why he refused to back down even when the odds were stacked against him. The network wasn't just a system or a project, it was a lifeline, a bridge between people who might otherwise never have the chance to connect. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, the network began to thrive again. With new faces joining the effort and old wounds starting to heal, the delivery man felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the challenges weren't over, that there would always be those who sought to tear down what they didn't understand. But he also knew that with determination, resilience, and the support of those who believed in him, he could face whatever came next. One day, as he walked through the bustling community center, he overheard a group of teenagers discussing a project they were working on together. They were laughing, their faces lit with excitement. It was a simple moment, but it struck him deeply. This was what it was all about, creating a space where people could dream, collaborate, and grow. As he stepped outside into the sunshine, the delivery man took a deep breath and smiled. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready for it. The battles he had fought had taught him that true strength didn't come from wealth or power, it came from connection, from standing together in the face of adversity. And as he looked toward the horizon, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would keep moving forward. Not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in a better tomorrow.